So imagine it is 1527.
Okay.
You are standing on the humid, just completely unforgiving coastline of what we now call Florida.
Hmm.
And a Spanish expedition, this is led by Pánfilo de Narváez, has just met with, like, absolute disaster.
Oh, yeah. A total catastrophe.
Right. Out of an initial force of, I think, 600 men who are aiming to claim the Gulf Coast, they get hit by hurricanes, starvation, disease. It just decimates their numbers.
Yeah, it was brutal.
And only 4 men managed to survive this massive shipwreck. They physically pull themselves out of the churning surf and onto the shores of Galveston Island, Texas. And one of those 4 men is named Muzafa Zemmouri. History would later remember him as Estevanico.
And, his story, it completely shatters the timeline we've all been taught in school.
Right, because Zemmouri wasn't a Spanish conquistador.
No, not at all.
He was born in Azamor, Morocco. He was a Muslim man who had been enslaved by the Spanish and dragged across the Atlantic. And in 1528, he begins this just grueling 8-year journey on foot across the interior of the North American continent.
Which is just wild to think about.
I mean, long before Jamestown. A full century before the Pilgrims stepped onto Plymouth Rock, right? He walked across present-day Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and he was learning, like, multiple Native American languages along the way.
Yeah, he became a primary negotiator.
Exactly, a negotiator and a healer for these desperate survivors.
He is, by all the historical accounts we have and the biographical data, one of the very first people from the Old World, and almost certainly the first Muslim, to physically traverse the interior of what would become the United States.
Which means we are stepping into a really profound moment today. For you listening, it is 2026. We are marking the 250th anniversary, the semi-quincentennial of the United States.
Quite a milestone.
It is. And our mission in this deep dive is to completely upend a historical assumption. Like, if you think of Muslims as recent arrivals to the American story, a demographic that just showed up in the late 20th century, you are about to see them as foundational co-authors of the American project.
Absolutely foundational.
We are diving into a brilliant new book today. It's titled American Islam, A Story of Shared Destiny at 250 by Dr. Iqbal Akhtar, along with his complementary research.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we're not just talking about historical trivia here, right?
No, not at all. This isn't about, finding a few footnotes in a textbook. We are tracing an unbroken, deeply ingrained thread of Islamic influence that runs through, well, America's earliest diplomacy, the literal physical engineering of its southern economy.
Agriculture, yeah.
Right. And the creation of its most iconic music, the expansion of constitutional rights, and even the absolute bleeding edge of its scientific achievements.
So let's pick up that thread in the founding era, because to really understand America at 250, we actually have to look at the years when the Republic was just this fledgling, vulnerable idea, right? Just fighting for its life against the British Empire.
It was not a sure thing, by any means.
No. In the late 1770s, the Continental Army is outgunned, underfunded, and they are just desperate for international legitimacy. Washington's forces need a geopolitical lifeline. And the very first sovereign nation to publicly recognize the independence of the United States wasn't France, and it wasn't Spain.
No, it was the Sultanate of Morocco.
Wow.
Yeah. On December 20, 1777, Sultan Sidi Muhammad III issued a formal decree. He publicly declared that all American ships were free to enter Moroccan ports on the exact same terms as any other nation that had a treaty with the Sultan.
I want to pause on the mechanics of this, though, because I don't think people realize how precarious international shipping was at that exact moment.
Yeah.
The U.S. no longer had the protection of the British Royal Navy.
Right, they were completely exposed.
American merchant ships were just sitting ducks in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, right?
Exactly. The Mediterranean was controlled by the Barbary states. And without naval protection or, established treaties, American commerce was essentially paralyzed. They couldn't trade.
They'd just get captured.
Right. So Sultan Muhammad III's decree was a massive geopolitical risk. What's fascinating here is that he was explicitly siding with a rebel colony against the global superpower of the time, the British Empire.
Which is huge flex, honestly.
It really was. This wasn't just a friendly gesture. It was a highly strategic diplomatic maneuver that gave the United States a crucial veil of legitimacy and physically safety for its commerce.
And this act of recognition, it eventually solidifies into something much more permanent, which is the Moroccan-American Treaty of Friendship, sealed in 1786.
Right.
Thomas Jefferson negotiated it from Paris, John Adams from London, and the U.S. Congress ratified it in the summer of 1787, which is literally the exact same summer they were sweating in Philadelphia drafting the U.S. Constitution.
And we really have to look at how that treaty was constructed. It was negotiated on the ground by an American diplomat named Thomas Barclay.
Okay.
And what Barclay secured was incredibly rare for the time. It was a comprehensive treaty covering diplomatic relations, trade protocols, mutual protections, and it required absolutely no promise of financial tribute.
Wait, really, no tribute at all.
None. The Sultan viewed it as a relationship between peers. And if we fast forward, that treaty was renewed in 1836, and it remains the longest unbroken treaty relationship in U.S. history.
That is insane.
We are talking about nearly 240 years of continuous diplomatic recognition.
It's like finding a massive ancient foundation stone under a house you thought was built yesterday.
Yeah.
And Dr. Akhtar's research highlights that Morocco wasn't an isolated incident either. A few years later, in 1797, we get the Treaty of Tripoli.
Yes, negotiated under George Washington and unanimously ratified by the U.S. Senate under John Adams. And this treaty contains what is arguably one of the most significant and debated statements on early American religious posture, specifically Article 11.
Right. The language in Article 11 is incredibly definitive. It explicitly states that the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion.
Right.
And it goes on to say that the U.S. has no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of Muslimin, which was a contemporary term for Muslims.
And to understand the gravity of that, you really have to realize what kind of diplomatic framework was operating here. We are seeing a specific covenantal logic.
Okay, break that down for me. What is covenantal logic in this specific context?
So, in European colonial statecraft of that era, relationships with non-Christian nations were often strictly transactional, right? Or they were defined by military dominance, this idea of subjugation.
Right. Conquer and extract.
Exactly. A covenant, however, implies a moral and relational binding. You have a Muslim monarch and a Christian majority republic consciously choosing to bind themselves to one another by a written reciprocal obligation.
They're choosing mutual respect over force.
Yes. They were establishing a framework of mutual respect that transcended their vast religious differences. The United States was essentially signaling to the Islamic world, our geopolitical identity is not defined by religious crusade.
I mean, that is huge. So we have this high-level international diplomacy happening. But at the exact same time, Muslims were physically fighting in the dirt and the snow for the nation's birth. Like, the historical record actually shows Muslims serving in the Continental Army.
Oh, absolutely. We have the actual military muster rolls, men like Bampet Mohammed, who served in the Virginia line, Yusuf Ben Ali, who fought under General Thomas Sumter down in South Carolina.
And Bunker Hill, right?
Yes, there were two celebrated heroes at the Battle of Bunker Hill, Peter Salem and Salem Poor. And contemporary historians and linguists note that their surnames are highly likely Americanized survivals of the Arabic word salam, meaning peace.
Which is a very common naming convention in West African Islamic cultures.
Exactly.
So I have to ask, why is this disconnect so persistent? We constantly talk about the founders' geopolitical brilliance, but this massive diplomatic and military integration with the Islamic world is totally decoupled from our narrative of early American diversity.
It's a great question, and it's largely because the history of Islam in America was subsequently obscured, just buried, really, by the transatlantic slave trade. Which brings us to a deeply painful but absolutely foundational chapter of the physical building of this nation.
Right. We have to look at the soil of the American South. The traditional, deeply entrenched historical myth suggests that enslaved people arrived on American shores as like blank slates.
Right, the idea that they had nothing.
Exactly. The narrative implies they were stripped of culture, lacking in advanced knowledge, and merely provided brute manual labor.
And that narrative is empirically demonstrably false.
Yeah.
Of the estimated 400,000 Africans forced into bondage in North America, historians estimate that roughly 24% came from the Senegambia region of West Africa.
And Senegambia had been highly Islamized for centuries by that point, right?
Since the 11th century. So these individuals did not arrive empty-handed. They brought centuries of deep Islamic learning, profound literacy, multilingualism, and crucially for the South, highly specialized, complex agricultural engineering.
Let's focus on that engineering, because this directly shaped the wealth of the original colonies. The research specifically highlights rice cultivation in South Carolina. How exactly did this technological transfer happen?
Well, think about the geography of South Carolina. The coastal lowcountry is marshy, it's tidal, and it is incredibly difficult to farm using traditional European methods.
It's basically a swamp.
Exactly. The English colonists had virtually no experience with rice. But the enslaved people from Senegambia had spent thousands of years refining wet rice cultivation along the Niger and Casamance rivers.
So they weren't just like tossing seeds into the mud, they were terraforming the landscape.
Precisely. They engineered massive, complex irrigation systems. They carved out tidal rivers, they built levees, and they constructed these sophisticated wooden floodgates called trunks.
How do the trunks work?
They relied on the gravitational pull of the moon and the tides to precisely flood and drain the rice fields. Yeah. This wasn't just manual labor, it was applied hydrology and advanced agronomy. They possessed the specific technological know-how that transformed South Carolina into one of the wealthiest and most powerful colonies in the British Empire.
So the physical and economic architecture of the South was literally engineered by enslaved West African Muslims.
Yes, it was.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because alongside that physical and economic engineering, there is this staggering intellectual resilience. Dr. Akhtar's book brings us to the story of Omar ibn Said, which is one of those historical accounts that just forces you to completely reevaluate everything you thought you knew.
Oh, Omar ibn Said is incredible. He was an Islamic scholar from Fouta Toro in present-day Senegal. Before he was captured and forced across the Atlantic, he had spent 25 years formally studying mathematics, astronomy, and theology.
25 years of higher education.
Yes. And he was enslaved in North Carolina.
And in 1831, while still enslaved, he writes a 16-page autobiography in classical Arabic. The manuscript physically exists today. It's preserved in the Library of Congress. But it's how he writes it that is so brilliant.
Right, because he opens his autobiography by writing out entirely from memory a specific chapter from the Quran, Surat al-Mulk.
I wanted to dig into the mechanics of that choice. Why that specific chapter? What does Surat al-Mulk actually say?
So Surat al-Mulk translates to the dominion or the sovereignty. The very first verses declare that ultimate sovereignty, dominion, and ownership over all creation belong exclusively to God.
Oh, man. That is an incredible, quiet theological rebellion.
It is the ultimate act of intellectual defiance. Omar is trapped in a brutal, dehumanizing legal system that officially categorizes him as chattel, as property owned by another human being.
Right.
And he sits down and writes in an elegant, complex language that his enslavers cannot even begin to decipher, a theological treatise stating that their claim of ownership is entirely invalid.
He's saying, you don't own me, only God owns anything.
Exactly. He asserts that true ownership belongs only to the Creator.
It's a complete reclamation of his humanity. And he wasn't an anomaly either. The research points to Bilali Muhammad on Sapelo Island in Georgia.
Yes, Bilali Muhammad.
He was managing a plantation of over 400 people. He openly maintained his daily Islamic prayers, wore a traditional fez, and he authored a 13-page Arabic manuscript on Maliki Islamic law.
Which is staggering. Maliki law is one of the 4 major schools of Islamic jurisprudence, specifically dominant in North and West Africa. For Bilali to write a legal text from memory under those conditions, it shows an unfathomable retention of complex legal theory.
Unbelievable.
And we also see figures like Abdul Rahman Ibrahim ibn Sori. He was an aristocratic military commander from Guinea who was enslaved for 40 years in Natchez, Mississippi.
He's known as the prince among slaves, right?
Yes, and he was eventually freed, but only after the Sultan of Morocco personally intervened with President John Quincy Adams.
Wait, really? The President of the United States and the Sultan of Morocco were negotiating the freedom of a specific enslaved man.
Yes, they were. Abdul Rahman had managed to get a letter, written in Arabic, delivered to the local U.S. senator. The senator forwarded it to the U.S. consulate in Morocco, who then showed it to the Sultan.
That is just wow.
The Sultan recognized Abdul Rahman's royal lineage based on the letter and requested his release. It's a staggering geopolitical intersection happening right in the middle of the American South.
And there are others too, like Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, who was enslaved in Maryland and literally wrote 3 complete copies of the Quran from memory.
From memory, yes.
The cognitive dissonance of the enslavers must have been deafening. I mean, how did the historical record reconcile a brutal system that justified itself by claiming Africans were intellectually inferior with the undeniable physical proof of their profound literacy and complex theology?
The short answer is they didn't. They suppressed it.
They just ignored it.
Or they twisted it. When enslavers encountered this deep literacy, they often treated it as an oddity, Or they tried to claim these individuals were Moors or Arabs, not Africans.
To preserve the racism.
Oh, exactly, to maintain their racist justifications for enslaving black people. But you cannot entirely erase that level of cultural gravity. It survived and it became deeply embedded in the culture of the South.
And we can literally still trace it today.
Absolutely. Look at the Gullah Geechee people of the coastal islands in Georgia and South Carolina. They maintain traditions directly descended from these enslaved West Africans. Today, they still bake special rice cakes called saraka.
And linguists have traced that, right?
Yes, linguists have traced that word directly to the Arabic word adaka, which means voluntary charity.
And there's the famous ring shout tradition too, right?
The ring shout, yes. It's a deeply spiritual, rhythmic dance where participants move counterclockwise in a circle, singing and shuffling their feet. For a long time, its origins were debated, but modern scholars have drawn direct structural parallels between the ring shout and the awaf.
What's the awaf?
That's the counterclockwise circumambulation of the Kaaba in Mecca that Muslims perform during the Hajj.
So the actual mechanics of the movement survive the Middle Passage. That is incredible. And that transitions us to something massive, because the physical labor and that intense spiritual resilience in those coastal fields didn't just yield rice and indigo.
No, it yielded much more.
They created the acoustic conditions that gave birth to America's most distinctive cultural export. We have to talk about the roots of the blues.
Yes. This is where history, musicology, and tragedy all intersect. If you trace the sonic lineage of jazz, the blues, and ultimately rock and roll, you are led definitively back to the Islamic musical traditions of West Africa's Sahel region.
Dr. Akhtar notes in the book that the United States received a much higher proportion of enslaved people from heavily Islamized regions than destinations like, say, Cuba or Brazil.
Right.
And this demographic reality directly shaped why the blues emerged specifically in the American South.
To understand the mechanics of this, we really have to look at how different West African cultures made music. In the coastal, non-Islamic regions of West Africa, music was heavily polyrhythmic, heavily focused on complex drumming ensembles.
Okay, lots of drums.
Lots of drums. But in the Sahel, this is the vast region stretching across Senegal, Mali, and Niger, the music was profoundly influenced by Islamic acoustic aesthetics. It heavily favored stringed instruments and a solo declamatory style of singing.
Okay, but both groups were enslaved and brought to the U.S. So why did the string-based solo vocal tradition of the Sahel completely dominate the American South while the drum traditions flourished in places like Haiti and Brazil?
Because of a specific, terrifying historical event. The Stoner Rebellion of 1739 in South Carolina.
What exactly happened there?
A group of enslaved people, primarily from the Congo region, organized a massive armed rebellion. And to coordinate their march and signal to others to join them, they used drums. See, in traditional Central and West African societies, drums were not just musical instruments, they were advanced martial communication devices. They could transmit complex messages over long distances.
So the colonial authorities realized the drums were a tactical threat.
Exactly. The rebellion was brutally suppressed, and in sheer terror, the South Carolina legislature passed the Negro Act of 1740. Among other horrific restrictions, it explicitly outlawed the use of drums, loud horns, or any instrument that could be used to signal.
And this ban spread.
Yes, it spread across the entire South.
So they essentially mandated a total acoustic redesign of the culture. They silenced the polyrhythmic drum traditions by law.
But here is the critical historical irony. By banning the drums, they inadvertently created an evolutionary void in the music. And what filled that void?
The strings.
The string-based solo vocal practices of the Islamic Sahelian musicians, which were not banned because the enslavers didn't view them as a military threat.
That is fascinating. The acoustic environment was artificially selected to favor the Sahelian traditions.
Yes. The West African kora and the ngoni, which are complex, lute-like stringed instruments, they were rebuilt in the Americas using gourds and animal skins. Thomas Jefferson himself documented in 1782 that the primary instrument of the enslaved Africans was what he called the banjo.
The banjo.
Which is the direct ancestor of the American banjo.
Okay, so the instrument survived. But it's not just the banjo, right? It's the human voice. It's the very structure of how the songs are sung.
This is where the musicology gets truly undeniable. Ethnomusicologists like Gerhard Kubik and historians like Sylviane Diouf have drawn a direct structural, sonic line between the Islamic adhan, the daily call to prayer, and the American field holler.
For someone who isn't a musician, break down what that actually sounds like. What are the shared mechanics?
Well, think about how a standard European hymn is structured. It's usually very metered, strictly keeping time, with notes that fall perfectly on the keys of a piano.
Right, very rigid.
Now listen to the Islamic call to prayer. It features a technique called melisma. This is where a single syllable of text is stretched out and glides over a series of different undulating notes.
It's a very fluid, soaring vocal style.
Exactly. It uses wavy intonation, nasal humming, and most importantly, it uses microtones.
What are microtones?
Microtones are the pitches that exist between the standard keys of a European piano. In the American South, these microtones evolved into what we now call blue notes, those bent, slightly flattened pitches that give the blues its deep emotional resonance.
Oh.
When you listen to a recording of an early 20th century field holler from the Mississippi Delta and play it side by side with a West African Islamic call to prayer, the grammatical structure of the music is virtually identical.
There is an incredible anecdote in Dr. Akhtar's research about Ali Farka Touré, the legendary Malian guitarist, dealing with exactly this.
Yes. When Touré, who is deeply rooted in the Sahelian musical tradition, first heard records of American blues legends like John Lee Hooker, he didn't view it as a foreign American invention.
What did he think it was?
He reportedly said that it was the music of the Niger Bend, his home, reflecting back at him.
Wow. If we pull the lens back on this, if the field holler evolves into the blues, and the blues is universally acknowledged as the foundational DNA of jazz, rock and roll, R&B, and modern pop, that means the acoustic architecture of the Islamic call to prayer is literally woven into the Billboard charts today.
From a strict musicological standpoint, absolutely. The very soundtrack of American suffering, its deep resilience, and ultimately its massive global pop culture dominance is fundamentally built on an Islamic musical framework.
That is just mind-blowing.
When these traditions converged in places like Congo Square in New Orleans, they planted the seeds for the entirety of modern American music.
So that cultural resilience, that intense assertion of identity, it doesn't just stay in the fields and it doesn't just stay in the concert halls. Eventually, as America matures, that assertion marches straight into the highest courts in the land.
It sure does.
And it fundamentally reshapes the legal definition of religious freedom for every single American citizen. I want to shift into the 20th century, to Muhammad Ali.
Ali is the perfect embodiment of this transition. Born Cassius Clay in Louisville, Kentucky, he shocked the American establishment when he publicly joined the Nation of Islam in 1964 and took the name Muhammad Ali.
But the turning point for American constitutional law happens in 1967.
Right.
The Vietnam War is escalating rapidly. Ali is at the absolute peak of his athletic prime. He is the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, and he receives his draft notice.
And he outright refuses induction into the U.S. Armed Forces. He stated very clearly that his participation in the war was strictly against the teachings of the Holy Quran. He declared that he was a conscientious objector.
And the government's response was swift and, frankly, merciless.
It was devastating. Within hours, he was stripped of his heavyweight title. Every state athletic commission suspended his boxing license. He was effectively banned from his profession during his most lucrative years, losing millions and millions of dollars.
And he was facing prison time.
Yes. The federal government charged him with draft evasion, and he was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, though he remained free on bail while he appealed.
This triggers a brutal 4-year legal battle that culminates in the 1971 Supreme Court case, Clay v. United States. The behind-the-scenes drama of what actually happened in the Supreme Court chambers is it's like a legal thriller. How did this play out?
To understand the drama, you have to understand the legal test for a conscientious objector at the time. Historically, this legal protection was an umbrella almost exclusively used by members of peace-oriented Christian sects, like the Quakers or the Mennonites.
Boy, pacifists.
Right. So the government's argument against Ali was that his objection was merely political and racial, not sincerely religious, because the Nation of Islam wasn't a traditional pacifist group.
So when the Supreme Court justices initially meet in conference to vote on Ali's case, what happens?
They vote 5-3 to affirm his conviction and send him to federal prison. Justice John Marshall Harlan II, a deeply respected conservative jurist, was assigned to write the majority opinion that would seal Ali's fate.
But Harlan doesn't write that opinion. And it's because of an intervention by his law clerk, right?
Right. Harlan's law clerk was a young man named Thomas Crattenmaker. Crattenmaker had been intensely studying the case, and he realized the government was misrepresenting Ali's theology. He convinced Justice Harlan to actually sit down and read the writings of Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam.
Specifically, his text message to the black man in America.
Exactly.
What did Harlan find when he actually read the text?
Harlan realized that Ali's theology did not oppose all war, which was the traditional Quaker stance, but rather it opposed participation in any war, not explicitly declared by God or his messenger. It was a holy war objection.
Okay, so how does that change the legal standing?
Well, Harlan realized that if the court denied Ali's claim because his religion allowed for holy war, they would also logically have to deny conscientious objector status to traditional Christians who believed in biblical holy wars, like Armageddon.
Oh, wow. So if they strike down Ali, they accidentally strike down the religious protections of millions of Christians.
Exactly. Harlan saw that Ali's beliefs, however unorthodox they appeared to the establishment, were deeply, sincerely held religious beliefs that absolutely met the legal standard. So Harlan completely changed his mind. He told the other justices he could no longer write the opinion convicting Ali.
And because Harlan flips, the court is deadlocked, which eventually forces a compromise. And the final decision is an 8-0 unanimous reversal in Ali's favor. His conviction is completely overturned.
And the legal ramifications of this are monumental. Muhammad Ali essentially stress-tested the First Amendment. He took a legal umbrella designed for a very narrow, specific subset of Western religious traditions, and through immense personal sacrifice, he stretched it wide enough to cover non-Western Islamic belief.
He forced the American legal system to recognize that religious freedom must apply equally to the margins of society, or it means nothing at all.
Exactly.
He cemented a broader legal maturation of American pluralism, and that is a perfect causal link to what happens next. Because when a society legally cements pluralism and protects the conscience of the individual, it becomes an incredibly powerful magnet for global talent.
It really does.
That widening of the First Amendment helped create the environment where modern American science could thrive, plugging the U.S. directly into the ancient intellectual traditions of the Islamic Golden Age.
That is a crucial connection. We often view American scientific dominance as an isolated modern phenomenon, but the foundations of Western science did not just spontaneously generate in Europe.
Right. The traditional narrative jumps straight from ancient Greece to the European Enlightenment, totally ignoring a massive 1,000-year bridge in between.
They ignore the Islamic scholars from the 8th through the 13th centuries who preserved, critiqued, and massively advanced human knowledge. We are talking about intellectual giants.
Like Al-Khwarizmi, right?
Yes. An 8th century mathematician. The very word algebra is derived from the title of his foundational textbook, Al-Jab. And the word algorithm is literally just the Latinized corruption of his name.
Or Ibn al-Haytham, right? The father of modern optics.
Yes. In the 11th century, he wrote the Book of Optics, which completely overturned the ancient Greek understanding of vision. The Greeks thought the eye emitted beams of light.
Like laser beams from your eyes.
Exactly. But Ibn al-Haytham proved that light bounces off objects and enters the eye. More importantly, he established rigorous frameworks for empirical testing, what we now recognize as the scientific method.
And then there's Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna. His massive medical encyclopedia, the Canon of Medicine, was the standard textbook in European medical universities for over 500 years.
500 years.
Dr. Akhtar makes a brilliant point in the book about how this knowledge transferred. Because Europe didn't just inherit a library of dusty facts from the Islamic world, they inherited the actual physical methodology of producing knowledge.
That's the key. How do you create an institution that consistently generates science? The Islamic world developed the madrasa, a college of higher learning, supported by a waqf, which is an irrevocable charitable endowment.
So funding in a campus.
Exactly. This structure, featuring licensed faculties, peer review, and teaching hospitals, was the direct architectural ancestor of the first European universities in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford.
So if you fast forward to modern America, you see that ancient intellectual momentum, that deep cultural reverence for empirical discovery, manifesting at the very pinnacle of American science today.
You really do.
Dr. Akhtar's research highlights 3 Muslim Americans who have won the Nobel Prize in chemistry. Let's break down exactly what they discovered, because the mechanics are incredible. First, Dr. Ahmed Zoil at Caltech, who won in 1999.
Dr. Zoil is known as the father of femtochemistry.
Wait, stop there. What is a femtosecond?
A femtosecond is 1/millionth of 1/billionth of a second.
I can't even process that.
To give you an analogy, a femtosecond is to a single second what a second is to 32 million years. It is an almost incomprehensible slice of time.
How is it even physically possible to capture something that fast? I'm picturing someone trying to photograph a speeding bullet with a disposable 1990s camera.
It requires extraordinary technology. Zoo Whale basically invented the world's fastest camera using ultra-fast laser pulses.
Okay.
Imagine you are in a pitch-black room with people dancing rapidly. If you turn on a strobe light that flashes for just a fraction of a second, the dancers appear frozen in motion, right?
Right.
Zewell used laser flashes lasting only femtoseconds to strobe light chemical reactions. He allowed humanity to observe in slow motion the exact, precise moment that individual atoms break their bonds and form new ones.
You literally film the fundamental building blocks of the universe interacting. That is staggering.
It's revolutionary.
And then in 2015, the Nobel went to Aziz Sankar at UNC Chapel Hill.
Sankar mapped out, at a molecular level, the machinery that living cells use to repair damaged DNA. Every single day, your DNA is bombarded and damaged by ultraviolet light from the sun and by free radicals.
And if your cells couldn't repair this damage, your body would succumb to cancer almost immediately, right?
Instantly.
So how does the repair mechanism actually work?
Sankar discovered a process called nucleotide excision repair. It's essentially a molecular text editor. He mapped the exact enzymes that slide along the DNA strand, detect a bulky UV-damaged lesion, snip the damaged section out like a pair of microscopic scissors, and patch it with fresh, healthy DNA.
Wow.
Understanding the specific mechanism is absolutely foundational to modern cancer treatments and our understanding of cellular aging.
And most recently, in 2023, the Nobel went to Mongi Bawendi at MIT.
Bawendi revolutionized the synthesis of quantum dots.
Okay, explain quantum dots to me like I'm 5 years old.
Imagine a tiny crystal of semiconductor material, so unimaginably small that it only contains a few thousand atoms. At this microscopic nanoscale, the normal laws of classical physics start to break down and quantum mechanics take over.
Okay, I'm with you.
Here is the magic of a quantum dot. Its optical properties, specifically the color of light it emits, are dictated entirely by its physical size.
Wait, so the exact same material changes color just because it's slightly bigger or smaller?
Yes. A larger dot might emit red light, while a slightly smaller dot of the exact same material emits blue light. This is dictated by the Schrödinger equation governing the electrons confined within the dot.
That's insane.
For decades, scientists knew this theoretically, but they couldn't manufacture them cleanly. Bawendi developed a chemical method to synthesize quantum dots with perfect, uniform precision.
And what do we use them for today?
Today, his discovery illuminates the brilliant colors in QLED television screens, and more importantly, it provides ultra-precise, glowing molecular markers used by surgeons to map tumors inside the human body during surgery.
You know, we constantly treat science and religion as if they are locked in this endless historical cage match. But looking at this narrative, they are completely intertwined. How did the classical Islamic worldview set the stage for these empirical breakthroughs?
Because in the classical Islamic intellectual tradition, there is no inherent contradiction between faith and empirical observation. Studying the natural world, uncovering its hidden laws, its mathematics, its physics, was viewed as a direct method of knowing the Creator. Nature was considered a second revelation.
Right.
Modern American scientific leadership is heavily dependent on its openness to immigrant brilliance. And in this case, that brilliance is carrying the DNA of a 1,200-year-old empirical tradition.
And what's fascinating is that this drive to understand the mechanics of the universe is paired with an equally intense drive to care for the people living in it. Which brings us to how this community structures compassion. We are moving from the chemistry lab to the economics of civil society.
Right. We are talking about philanthropy. But in Islam, philanthropy isn't just left to warm, fuzzy sentiments or, end-of-year tax deductions. It is structurally, legally embedded into the theology. It is one of the 5 pillars of the faith.
Let's break down those pillars. Dr. Akhtar's book discusses zakat and adaka. What is the difference?
Zakat is not optional. It is an obligatory religious tax. It is mandated at 2.5% of a person's accumulated wealth over a certain threshold, paid annually.
So it's not based on your paycheck.
No, it's crucial to understand this isn't an income tax, it's a wealth tax. The purpose is to prevent the hoarding of capital and ensure that wealth constantly circulates down to the most vulnerable in society.
And adaka.
Sadaqah, on the other hand, is voluntary, everyday charity given out of spontaneous generosity.
The research cites a 2021 study by the Muslim Philanthropy Initiative at Indiana University, and the numbers are just astronomical. Muslim Americans gave an estimated $4.3 billion in charitable contributions in a single year.
Let's ground that statistic at the household level. The average Muslim American household donated $3,242 to charity that year. For comparison, the average for the general U.S. population was $1,905.
But the metric that truly shatters the public misperception is where that money actually goes. There's a persistent, cynical narrative that minority diaspora communities only send money overseas. But the study shows that 85% of this giving stays right here within the United States.
It creates an invisible, massive infrastructure of domestic generosity. Yes, a portion goes to international disaster relief, but the vast majority is funding local civil rights organizations, domestic violence shelters, and massive non-sectarian networks of free medical clinics and food pantries.
What does that $3,242 look like on the ground?
It looks like the Shifa clinics. Across the country, networks of Muslim medical professionals run free clinics that serve anybody who walks through the door, regardless of their faith or lack of insurance.
Wow.
During the COVID-19 pandemic, this community, which represents roughly 1% of the U.S. population, contributed vastly disproportionate resources to frontline relief efforts.
And the demographic footprint of the people funding and running this safety net is incredibly unique, isn't it?
It is the single most racially diverse major faith group in the United States. There's absolutely no majority race. You have a community comprised of African Americans whose roots go back to the origins of the country, alongside immigrants from South Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe.
That's a huge spectrum.
And they are highly educated, with 46% holding college degrees, and they are heavily overrepresented in vital sectors like healthcare, technology, engineering, and increasingly public office.
So I have a fundamental question. Where does this deep commitment to building a shared civic life come from? Building institutions for everyone, not just your own in-group. The book argues this isn't some modern 21st century assimilation strategy. It is rooted in a constitutional document drafted 1,400 years ago.
This is perhaps the most vital historical anchor in the entire text. We are talking about the Afet al-Medina, commonly known as the Compact of Medina, or the Constitution of Medina.
Take us back to 622 CE. What is the context of this document?
In 622 CE, the Prophet Muhammad and his early followers fled intense persecution in Mecca and migrated to an oasis city called Yathrib, which was later renamed Medina. When they arrived, Medina was on the brink of a brutal civil war.
Over what?
The city was a volatile mix of Muslim immigrants, local Arab tribes, some of whom were still pagan, and several powerful Jewish clans.
It sounds like a recipe for absolute chaos.
It was. So the Prophet Muhammad drafted a formal written agreement to prevent bloodshed and establish a functioning society. By many scholarly accounts, the Compact of Medina is one of the earliest written constitutions in human history.
Okay, how did it work?
It legally bound these wildly diverse, fractured groups into a single body politic, a single ummah for the purposes of mutual defense, justice, and social order.
But the crucial mechanism here, the truly revolutionary part, is that it didn't mandate conversion to Islam to be part of the state, right?
Exactly. It explicitly guaranteed that each group would retain its own religious freedom. Clause by clause, it stated that the Muslims had their religion and the Jewish clans had theirs.
But they still work together.
Yes. Despite their profound theological differences, they were equal shareholders in the defense of the city and the resolution of disputes. This raises an important question about how we even define a nation today.
It's proto-Islamic public law. It's essentially an ancient open-source code for democracy. The idea that you do not have to assimilate, you do not have to erase your differences to be an equal citizen in the polity. You can draw a direct line between the Compact of Medina and the American motto, E pluribus, unum ad of many, one, and the protections of the First Amendment.
And this pluralism wasn't just a pragmatic political compromise. It had a deep theological warrant. The Quran itself frames diversity as a divine intention.
Oh.
Surah 49, verse 13, explicitly states that God created humanity into different nations and tribes that you may come to know one another, a concept called ta'aruf.
Ta'aruf.
The text argues that diversity is not a curse, and it's not a historical accident. It is a deliberate mechanism designed by God to foster mutual understanding and intellectual growth.
So, if the historical blueprint for pluralism is so clear, how is the contemporary American Muslim community applying it right now? In 2026, the U.S. is grappling with deep, effective political polarization at home and the shadow of extremism abroad. How does a 1,400-year-old compact function today?
The book outlines how the community is actively forging a contemporary covenant, First, they have fiercely addressed the theological distortions of extremism. Dr. Akhtar details a pivotal moment in 2014 when an open letter was issued to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS.
I remember this. It was signed by a huge number of scholars.
Over 126 prominent Islamic scholars globally, including major American figures.
How did they dismantle the ISIS ideology?
They didn't just condemn it politically, they dismantled it surgically, point by point, using classical Islamic jurisprudence. They proved that ISIS's actions, the targeting of innocents, the destruction of graves, the forced conversions, were strictly forbidden by Islamic law.
They used their own texts against them.
Exactly. They demonstrated that extremism is a profound mutation and a violation of the faith's core legal texts.
And domestically, we see an evolution led by figures like Worth D. Muhammad.
Yes, W.D. Muhammad is a towering figure in American history. In 1975, following the death of his father, Elijah Muhammad, he assumed leadership of the Nation of Islam. Over the next decade, he engineered an incredible transformation, guiding hundreds of thousands of African-American Muslims toward mainstream Orthodox Sunni Islam.
That is a massive demographic shift.
It was. He dismantled the racialized theology of the past and wholly embraced the U.S. Constitution. He taught that there is zero contradiction between being fully, authentically Muslim and being a dedicated American citizen.
And bringing it to this exact moment in time, the research introduces a highly relevant contemporary declaration, the Mithaq al-Ta'aruf, or the Covenant of Mutual Acquaintance.
This document is a modern manifestation of the Medinan ideal. Drafted by contemporary Muslim scholars, it sets out a comprehensive Islamic case for religious pluralism, the universal dignity of all human beings, and the absolute unequivocal rejection of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and terrorism.
One of the mechanics of this document that really caught my attention was its reliance on the concept of the Ansar.
Yes. The Ansar, which translates to the helpers, were the original residents of Medina who welcomed the Prophet and the destitute refugees fleeing Mecca.
Right.
The Covenant of Mutual Acquaintance takes this historical role and elevates it to a perpetual theological obligation. It argues that modern Muslims have a religious duty to embody the spirit of the Ansar by welcoming the stranger and protecting the refugee, the Ibn al-Sabil or wayfarer, regardless of that refugee's background, religion, or origin.
We have to acknowledge the reality of the U.S. at its 250th anniversary. We are looking at a republic that feels intensely fractured. Trust in institutions is plummeting. Political polarization is at a fever pitch. But this document introduces a concept that Dr. Akhtar calls covenantal pluralism.
Covenantal pluralism is a vital upgrade to our current civic software. Much of modern society relies on what we might call thin, grudging tolerance, like, I'll leave you alone if you leave me alone.
Right, just coexistence.
But covenantal pluralism asks for something much harder, but much more resilient. It demands robust solidarity. It requires citizens who hold profoundly different, even conflicting convictions to actively commit to each other's flourishing.
That's a high bar.
It is. It argues that institutions like the local mosque don't just exist for private prayer. They function as active schools of civic integration.
The narrative here is incredibly powerful. American Muslims aren't just asking for a seat at a fracturing, polarized table. They are bringing a 1,400-year-old carpentry tradition to help rebuild the table itself. They are actively modeling how communities divided by deep convictions can remain united by a shared civic covenant.
Because to strengthen a republic, you do not need everyone to believe the exact same things. You need them to know one another, to engage in that Quranic concept of ta'aruf, and to keep faith with one another across the boundaries of what they cannot share.
Which brings us to the end of an absolutely incredible journey. For you listening, we have covered a staggering expanse of ground today. We started in 1527 with Estevanico surviving a shipwreck to walk the vast deserts of the Southwest.
It's been a long trip.
We analyzed the diplomatic foundation stones laid by Morocco in 1786, saving American shipping. We explored the quiet theological defiance of enslaved Muslim scholars like Omar ibn Said, engineering the wealth of the Carolinas. We unpacked the acoustic evolution of how the rhythmic, vocal resilience of the Sahel literally gave birth to the American blues.
We watched Muhammad Ali stretch the First Amendment to protect the consciences of all Americans. We saw immigrant chemists translate the ancient empirical methods of the Islamic Golden Age into Nobel Prizes. And we discovered the ancient constitutionalism of Medina echoing in modern philanthropy.
What this history proves, unequivocally, is that the future belongs to the bridge builders. It belongs to those who possess the historical precedent and the grammatical structure to hold difference together without dissolving it. The American experiment in self-government has had Muslim hands actively engineering it from the very first day.
That's the core message. Absolutely.
So I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. If the cultural and legal bedrock of America was significantly shaped by Islamic thought, by early diplomacy, by the music of the Sahel, and by the profound intellect of enslaved scholars, how might fully acknowledging this shared DNA completely change the way we teach American history to the next generation?
It changes everything.
When you look closely at the foundation of that historical house we talked about, you don't just see a linear addition of diverse parts arriving late to the party. You see that the other you thought arrived yesterday has actually been staring back at you in the mirror the entire time. And if that's true, if our DNA is that deeply entangled, does the concept of a culture war even make sense anymore? Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.